in 1244 on a mountain fortress in southern France. 225 people chose to walk into the flames rather than renounce their faith. They sang hymns as the fire consumed them. The Catholic Church called them heretics. History barely remembers their names. But what these people believed was so dangerous, so threatening to the Vatican's power, that Pope Innocent III launched a crusade not against Muslims in distant lands, but against fellow Christians in Europe. What truth did the Cathars possess that required their complete annihilation? Why did the Church need to erase every trace of their existence? And what can we learn from the secrets they died protecting? Today, we're uncovering one of history's most suppressed chapters, a genocide hidden in plain sight and a spiritual truth the Vatican hoped would never see daylight again. Before we dive deep, you need to understand something crucial. This isn't just another medieval history lesson. The systematic destruction of the Cathars represents one of the first genocides in European history, and it fundamentally shaped the Catholic Church's approach to controlling religious thought for centuries to come. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, were a Christian sect that flourished in the Languedoc region of southern France during the 12th and 13th centuries. But calling them just another sect drastically understates what they represented. These weren't simple dissenters quibbling over minor theological points. The Cathars presented an entirely different interpretation of Christianity, one that challenged the Vatican's authority at its very foundation. Their influence spread rapidly. At their peak, roughly 1,000 Cathar clergy lived in Languedoc alone, with supporters numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Towns and cities across southern France embraced their teachings. Noble families protected them. Common people revered them. The movement had become so powerful that the Catholic Church faced a terrifying prospect: the possibility of losing control over an entire region of Christendom. The Vatican's response: total war. Not just against soldiers, but against entire populations. Not just against believers, but against the very ideas they held sacred. To understand why the Church felt so threatened, we need to grasp what the Cathars actually believed. Their theology was radical in ways that struck at the heart of Catholic power and wealth. The Cathars were dualists. They believed in two gods, a good god of the spiritual realm and an evil god of the material world. According to Cathar teaching, the physical universe, including our bodies, was created not by the benevolent God of the New Testament, but by an evil demiurge, often identified with Satan. The material world was inherently corrupt, a prison for divine souls trapped in flesh. Think about the implications. If the physical world is evil, then the Catholic Church's elaborate material displays, the golden chalices, the ornate cathedrals, the vast landholdings, the accumulation of wealth, all of it was not just unnecessary, but spiritually corrupting. The Cathars rejected church buildings entirely, holding their ceremonies in homes and fields. The Cathars saw Jesus differently too. They didn't believe in his physical incarnation. To them, Christ was a purely spiritual being who only appeared to have a human body. This meant they rejected the crucifixion as Catholics understood it, and they completely dismissed the idea of transubstantiation, that bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood during Mass. Without transubstantiation, the Catholic priest's central role became meaningless. But here's where it gets even more revolutionary. The Cathars had their own clergy called parfaits, or perfects, both men and women. These spiritual leaders lived lives of extreme asceticism, refusing meat, eggs, and cheese, practicing celibacy, and owning virtually nothing. And here's the kicker: women could become parfaits with exactly the same authority as men. In an age when the Catholic Church forbade women from any religious authority whatsoever, the Cathars were ordaining female spiritual leaders. The Cathars also rejected the entire Old Testament. They saw the vengeful God of the Hebrew Bible as the evil creator God, not the true divine Father that Jesus spoke of. They refused to take oaths, which created massive problems in a feudal society built on sworn allegiances. They opposed capital punishment. And perhaps most radical of all, they questioned the very foundations of church authority, claiming that individuals could achieve salvation through direct spiritual knowledge, gnosis, rather than through the mediation of priests and sacraments. The Catholic Church didn't just disagree with these ideas. It recognized them as an existential threat. How did this movement become so powerful that it required military intervention to suppress? The roots of Catharism likely trace back to earlier dualist movements in the Balkans, particularly the Bogomils of Bulgaria. Traveling merchants, crusaders, and wandering clergy spread these ideas westward through trade routes, but Catharism found particularly fertile ground in the Languedoc region for specific reasons. Southern France, in the 12th century, was culturally distinct from the north. The Occitan language was spoken here, creating a separate cultural identity. The region was wealthy, benefiting from Mediterranean trade. Its courts patronized troubadours and fostered the culture of relative tolerance and intellectual inquiry. The local nobility operated with considerable independence from both the French crown and Rome. Most importantly, the Catholic Church in this region was widely seen as corrupt. Local bishops lived in luxury while preaching poverty. The gap between doctrine and practice was glaring, and the people noticed. When the austere Cathar parfaits arrived, walking barefoot, owning nothing, preaching with genuine conviction, they offered a stark moral contrast. People could see which religious leaders actually lived according to their stated principles. The movement grew rapidly through the late 1100s. Noble families converted, providing protection and legitimacy. Towns established Cathar communities openly. The Catholic hierarchy sent preachers to debate the Cathars publicly, but these debates often backfired, with Cathar representatives proving more scripturally knowledgeable and rhetorically skilled than their Catholic opponents. By the early 1200s, Pope Innocent III faced a crisis. An entire region was slipping away from Catholic control. Peaceful persuasion had failed. Theological arguments had failed. The situation demanded a more direct approach. The Vatican's solution would redefine the meaning of Christian warfare. In 1208, a papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau was assassinated, likely by a knight in the service of Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, who had been excommunicated for his tolerance of Cathars. Pope Innocent III seized this opportunity. He declared a crusade not against infidels in the Holy Land, but against Christians in France. This was unprecedented. Never before had a pope called a crusade against fellow believers in the heart of Europe. But Innocent III was nothing if not pragmatic about power. He offered the same spiritual rewards as crusading to Jerusalem: complete remission of sins, protection of property, and cancellation of debts. But, with one crucial addition, crusaders could also claim the lands of heretics for themselves. The northern French nobility needed little more encouragement. The wealthy south had always been tempting, and now they had papal blessing to invade with both spiritual and material incentives. In 1209, an army of crusaders assembled under the leadership of Arnaud Amalric, the abbot of Queteau, and Simon de Montfort, a French nobleman hungry for land and glory. The crusading force was massive. Estimates suggest around 20,000 fighters. Their first target was the town of Béziers. The Crusaders demanded the town hand over its Cathars. The Catholic citizens of Béziers refused, unwilling to betray their neighbors. The Crusaders laid siege. What happened next has echoed through history as one of the most brutal massacres of the Middle Ages. When the city walls were breached, Crusaders poured in and began indiscriminately slaughtering everyone they found. Soldiers supposedly asked Arnaud Amalric how to distinguish Catholics from Cathars. His reported response has become infamous: "Kill them all. God will know his own." Whether he actually said these exact words is debated by historians, but what's not debated is what happened. Between 7,000 and 20,000 people were murdered in a single day: men, women, children, Catholics and Cathars alike. People who fled to churches for sanctuary were burned alive inside. The city was left in ruins. The message was clear and terrifying. This would not be a war of conversion or theological debate. This was to be total war, aimed at absolute submission through overwhelming terror. The Albigensian Crusade did not unfold merely as a military campaign. It evolved into a relentless spiritual purge designed to crush an idea the Vatican considered more dangerous than any invading army. After Béziers, where thousands had been slaughtered without distinction, the Crusaders advanced through Languedoc with a clarity of purpose that went beyond territorial conquest. They were not simply reclaiming land. They were attempting to suffocate a worldview the Church believed could unravel the very foundations of Catholic authority, a Gnostic vision of Christianity that taught ordinary people they could reach the divine without priests, sacraments, or Rome. Town after town fell, some opening their gates instantly upon hearing the fate of Béziers, others resisting until the final moment, forcing the Crusaders to demonstrate again and again that there would be no mercy for those who protected the Cathars. At Lavore in 1211, 80 knights were hanged in a display of vengeance meant to break the regional nobility's will. The Lady of Lavore, accused of aiding Cathars, was thrown into a well and stoned to death. 400 Cathars were burned in a mass execution that resembled not a punishment, but a ritualistic eradication, an attempt to erase the living carriers of a forbidden theology the Church believed could collapse Christendom if allowed to spread. At Minerve, 140 Cathars, who refused to renounce their belief in the good God of spirit over the false god of matter, were burned alive. Their refusal wasn't merely stubbornness, it reflected a profound Gnostic conviction that physical death was liberation from the material world, which they believed the evil demiurge, the false creator god, had fashioned as a prison. Each refusal to convert was, from the Church's perspective, a catastrophic threat. Every martyrdom reaffirmed a spiritual system that made the Vatican's power structures irrelevant. But the Cathars did not simply accept their fate. Local lords who valued Occitan independence, cultural freedom, and religious diversity resisted bitterly. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, though Catholic by identity, understood that if the Cathars fell, so would the entire political autonomy of the South. This war was not just theological, it was cultural, political, and existential. Yet beneath all these layers, a deeper struggle simmered, the battle between an institutional monopoly on salvation and a mystical Gnostic doctrine that claimed salvation was internal, individual, and unmediated. The Crusades' brutality reshaped the landscape. Farms burned, vineyards uprooted, towns razed, and entire populations scattered or killed. But its psychological impact was even more devastating. The Crusaders carried papal banners and indulgences, embodying a terrifying message. Rome did not merely reject Gnostic theology, it feared it so profoundly that it sanctioned genocide to ensure its extinction. By 1229, the Treaty of Paris signaled the military surrender of Languedoc, but not the spiritual submission Rome demanded. The Cathars had been scattered, not extinguished. Their ideas, especially the belief that the material world was the domain of a corrupt demiurge, still circulated in whispered gatherings, hidden rooms, and remote valleys. And the Vatican understood something chilling. Ideas survive even when bodies do not. Military victory had crushed the region, but erasing a Gnostic truth required a darker tool, one capable not only of punishing bodies, but rewriting minds, memories, and loyalties. That tool was already being prepared. It would soon be known as the Inquisition. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX created an institution whose very design reflected a singular purpose: to hunt down and annihilate not just a people, but an idea, a Gnostic interpretation of Christianity that threatened the Vatican's authority at its roots. This institution, the Papal Inquisition, was not a spontaneous reaction, nor a temporary wartime measure. It was a calculated system of surveillance, interrogation, and ideological cleansing, engineered to finish what the Crusaders had begun: the extinction of the Cathars and the erasure of their forbidden teachings. Placed under the Dominican order, the Inquisition operated with a clarity of mission that no army could achieve. Soldiers could burn towns, but they could not rewrite memory. They could kill believers, but they could not trace invisible streams of heretical ideas moving from house to house, whispered in kitchens, traded in markets, or carried by wandering parfaits who still believed the material world was the creation of a false god. To destroy a movement whose power lay in its interpretation of the divine, the Vatican needed an institution that targeted the mind as ruthlessly as the sword targeted the body. When inquisitors arrived in a town, they announced a period of grace, a deceptive calm that lured people into believing mercy was still possible. Anyone who confessed to errors in belief, especially ideas identifying the physical world as the domain of an evil demiurge, received reduced penance. But after the grace period ended, the real machinery of suppression began. Villagers were summoned to secret hearings. The identities of the accusers were concealed. Testimony was collected behind closed doors, where neither sunlight nor justice could reach. People discovered that the danger was not merely external. The Inquisition turned friends, neighbors, and even family into potential witnesses for Rome. The Inquisitors' power rested not on evidence, but on control, and their process was designed to crush any worldview that contradicted Catholic orthodoxy. The accused were often unaware of their supposed crime until the trial itself. A single unguarded statement questioning the Church's wealth, doubting transubstantiation, repeating a Cathar, teaching that Christ was a spiritual being untouched by matter, could be grounds for imprisonment, torture, or execution. To the Inquisition, these beliefs were not harmless theological deviations. They were echoes of the same Gnostic truth the Church had been fighting for centuries, that divinity existed beyond the reach of Rome, and salvation could not be monopolized. Torture, officially regulated but widely abused, became the primary weapon for extracting confessions recorded with bureaucratic precision. The rack stretched limbs until joints tore, the strappado wrenched shoulders out of sockets, the brodequin crushed legs piece by piece. Through these methods, the Inquisition wasn't merely punishing heresy, it was attempting to terrorize the region into abandoning a spiritual worldview that denied the Church's authority over the soul. Even those who escaped death rarely escaped destruction. Many were sentenced to wear yellow crosses sewn onto their clothing, public markers of disgrace that condemned them to lifelong humiliation. Their property was confiscated by the Church, leaving families impoverished. Entire lineages were dismantled, lands absorbed, wealth transferred upwards, turning heresy persecution into an economic engine for Rome. The Vatican was not simply erasing Gnostic belief, it was strengthening its temporal power through the ruins of those who had challenged it. The irony is almost unbearable. What we know today about Cathar spirituality, its dualism, its asceticism, its belief in the good God and the false creator, comes primarily from Inquisition records. The very institution designed to wipe out the Cathars became the only surviving archive of their existence. Every confession extracted under torture, every deposition, every denunciation preserved in brittle medieval Latin is a fragment of the world the Vatican tried to make disappear. By the mid-1200s, the Inquisition had accomplished something no army could. It had penetrated the private spaces of Languedoc, shattering trust, fragmenting families, and making ordinary life a maze of fear. People learned to speak cautiously even in their own homes, knowing a disgruntled neighbor or a frightened child could unwittingly condemn them. The Gnostic flame of Cathar belief, once bright, visible, unapologetic, now flickered only in hidden rooms, remote mountains, and the hearts of a dwindling number of believers. But for all its power, the Inquisition could not extinguish the final, defiant refuge of Cathar faith. One fortress remained, one mountain, one last testament to a Gnostic truth Rome was desperate to bury. That place was Montségur. High in the jagged spine of the Pyrenees stood Montségur, a stone citadel balanced on a knife edge of mountain rock, so steep and unreachable that it seemed less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary suspended between earth and sky. By the 1240s, this remote stronghold had become the final living heart of Catharism, not merely a military refuge, but a spiritual ark safeguarding the last remnants of a worldview the Vatican had vowed to obliterate. Within its walls lived around 500 souls, parfaits, believers, families, and soldiers, all bound by a single unifying truth that the material world was a prison crafted by a false god, and that the good God of pure spirit awaited them beyond its illusions. Montségur was more than a castle. It was a symbol of defiance against both the French crown and the Catholic Church. Here, the Cathars' Gnostic teachings persisted openly. Here, the parfaits still administered the consolamentum, the ritual that freed the soul from the corruption of flesh. And here, the Vatican saw a catastrophe waiting to happen. If Montségur remained unconquered, if its Gnostic interpretation of Christianity continued to thrive, then the decades of crusades and inquisitions would be futile. Montségur represented not only resistance, it represented survival of a spiritual truth Rome had labeled too dangerous to exist. In May 1243, a royal army of roughly 6,000 men encircled the mountain. What followed was not merely a siege, it was the slow tightening of a noose around the last free Gnostic community in Europe. Montségur's cliffs made direct assault nearly impossible, but the attackers did not need to storm the walls. They cut supply lines, blocked routes, and waited. Summer's heat pressed down. Autumn storms battered the cliffs. Winter froze the mountain into a cage of ice. Inside the fortress, food dwindled and hope thinned, yet the spirit of the defenders did not break. They had already accepted that the physical world was the realm of suffering and illusion. Endurance was simply another trial of the flesh before the liberation of the soul. Despite their courage, the outcome was inevitable. By early 1244, battered by trebuchets, isolated from aid, and facing starvation, Montségur could no longer stand. White negations began. The terms offered were deceptively simple. Anyone willing to renounce Cathar belief would be spared. They would confess before the Church, return to Catholic orthodoxy, and live. But for those who refused, there would be only one path: death by fire. It was here, in this moment of choice, that Montségur transformed from a fortress into a crucible of spiritual conviction. Over the next 2 weeks, the Cathar parfaits moved quietly through the fortress, offering the consolamentum to those who wished to die purified, those who believed that the flames awaiting them were not annihilation, but release from the demiurge's world. Some had delayed the ritual their entire lives, waiting for a moment when they were ready to surrender the final ties to matter. Now, with death certain, they stepped forward. Their voices whispered prayers that had survived centuries of suppression, prayers the Vatican feared because they bypassed priests, sacraments, and church authority entirely. On March 16, 1244, the gates of Montségur opened. A procession of roughly 225 Cathars walked down the mountain voluntarily. Chroniclers say they descended calmly, singing hymns that spoke of the good God, of the divine light trapped within mortal flesh, of liberation beyond suffering. They did not resist, they did not plead, they did not renounce. To them, the material world, the world controlled by Rome, had already been rejected. What waited at the foot of the mountain was not execution, it was an escape. A massive wooden pyre had been constructed in a field below, known today as the Field of the Burned. When they arrived, the Cathars stepped onto the pyre willingly. Some embraced, some prayed. Some lifted their faces to the sky, as if expecting the illusion of the material world to peel away at the moment of death. Unlike the massacres of Béziers or Lavore, where victims were slaughtered in terror, Montségur was a ritual of self-offering. It was collective martyrdom rooted in a Gnostic understanding of salvation that the Vatican could neither comprehend nor tolerate. And then the flames were lit. Witnesses claimed the Cathars continued singing as the fire consumed them. Whether myth or truth, the image became immortal, hundreds of men and women standing together in the flames, defying the demiurge's world one final time, choosing spiritual freedom over life under institutional domination. To the Church, their deaths represented victory. To history, they represented something far more haunting, a truth so powerful that it required genocide to suppress. With Montsegor's fall, organized Catharism ceased to exist. Small pockets of believers lingered for another generation, hiding in caves, forests, and mountains, hunted relentlessly by inquisitors. But the spiritual lineage, the Gnostic heart of the Cathar faith, the belief in a pure God beyond matter, a divine spark in every soul, and salvation without intermediaries, was nearly extinguished. Nearly, because despite the Church's efforts, Montsegur left behind a shadow burned into the memory of Europe, a scar that refused to heal, a question that would echo across centuries. What kind of truth requires this level of violence to erase? Now that we understand the brutal sequence of events, we must confront the deeper question that historians often avoid because its implications are too unsettling. Why did the Vatican consider the Cathars so dangerous that it waged a genocide against them? Why mobilize armies, authorize massacres, build the Inquisition, and pursue extermination for more than a century? The answer lies not in politics alone, nor in regional rivalry, nor even in heresy as traditionally defined. The true conflict was spiritual and structural, a direct confrontation between two incompatible visions of God, salvation, and the human soul. In the medieval world, the Catholic Church stood as the supreme arbiter of divine truth. Its power was not merely religious, it was political, economic, and existential. The Church owned vast lands, collected tithes, and influenced kings. It governed through sacraments and mediated salvation itself. To challenge the Church's interpretation of God was to threaten its entire system of authority. But the Cathars did not simply challenge doctrine. They proposed a Gnostic framework that undermined the Church at every foundational point. Cathars taught that the material world was not the creation of a benevolent God, but of a false, corrupt demiurge, a deceptive architect who trapped divine souls in physical bodies. This was not a metaphor. It was a radical cosmology that reframed human existence as imprisonment and salvation as escape. And here lay the Vatican's deepest fear. If the world was the domain of a false creator, then the Church, rooted in worldly structures and material rituals, could no longer claim to be the path to God. The Cathars rejected the Church's sacraments because they viewed matter as inherently polluted. They rejected the crucifixion because they believed Christ never took a physical body. They rejected oaths because truth belonged to the soul, not institutions. They rejected priestly intercession because salvation depended on inner knowledge, gnosis, not ceremony. And they accepted women as spiritual equals, granting them the authority to administer the consolamentum. Each of these differences was a theological challenge. Together they constituted a revolutionary spiritual system that threatened to dismantle the Church's monopoly. From Rome's perspective, Catharism was a parallel Christianity, one that bypassed the Church entirely. It offered a direct path to God without priests, without sacraments, without tithes, without cathedrals, without Rome itself. Its parfaits owned nothing, lived simply, and did not charge for rituals. Their purity made the luxuries of bishops and abbots look grotesque by comparison. And because Cathar teachings resonated with ordinary people, peasants, nobles, merchants, the movement spread rapidly in a region where the Church's corruption was widely recognized. But the threat went beyond social influence. The Cathars revived elements of early Christian Gnosticism that the Church believed it had crushed centuries earlier. These ideas taught that divine truth was not the property of a hierarchy, but an inner illumination available to anyone seeking it sincerely. To a medieval church that defined itself as the gatekeeper of salvation, such a teaching was catastrophic. If the Cathars were right, then the church's entire structure, its wealth, rituals, hierarchy, and authority was a spiritual counterfeit. This was the Vatican's nightmare, a Christianity that did not need the church. But there was something even more dangerous. Cathars believed that martyrdom purified the soul by breaking the last chains of the material world. Every Cathar who died for their belief did not weaken the movement, they strengthened it spiritually. Witnesses saw people walking into flames with calm conviction, and they wondered, what kind of truth inspires such fearlessness? Rome understood this. It understood that to kill the Cathars physically was not enough. Their ideas had to be made unthinkable. Their memory had to be discredited. Their writings had to be burned. Their worldview had to be erased so completely that future generations would not even know such a path had existed. This was not just suppression of heresy, it was the erasure of an alternative spiritual universe. The Cathars believed that every soul carried a divine spark, longing to return to the good God. The Vatican taught that salvation required church mediation. These two visions could not coexist. One made the church indispensable, the other made it irrelevant. In this irreconcilable conflict, the existence of Catharism posed a question the church could not afford to let people ask. What if the gatekeepers of God had built their power on a lie? The Albigensian Crusade, the Inquisition, the sieges, the pyres. These were not just tools of punishment, they were the instruments of a spiritual monopoly defending itself with every weapon available, and the Vatican was willing to do whatever was necessary to ensure that a Gnostic interpretation of Christianity did not survive to challenge its authority. In the end, the true battlefield was not Languedoc, nor its castles, nor even Montségur. The true battlefield was the human soul, and in that struggle, Rome demanded total victory. Genocide does not end when the killing stops. It ends when memory dies, when a people's voice is silenced so completely that future generations never even realize something was lost. After the military defeat of the Cathars and the relentless hunt carried out by the Inquisition, the Vatican turned to the second phase of its campaign, a quieter, colder phase. If the Cathars could no longer be eliminated physically, then their ideas had to be erased from the human imagination. This was the final battle, and in many ways the most successful one the Church ever fought. Books were targeted first. Cathar, writings, scriptures, hymns, commentaries, philosophical dialogues were sought out with almost obsessive intensity. Any manuscript suspected of containing dualist teachings was seized and burned. Villages were searched, monasteries were inspected, traders were questioned. A handwritten page found in a chest might be enough to condemn an entire family. The goal was simple: destroy every trace of a Gnostic interpretation of Christianity before future generations could rediscover it. And in this effort, the Church succeeded with terrifying completeness. Today, only a handful of Cathar texts survive, and even those are fragmentary. Most of what the Cathars believed is known only because the Inquisition recorded their confessions under duress. Imagine trying to understand Judaism solely through the writings of the Nazis, or learning about indigenous American civilizations exclusively from conquistador reports. That is exactly our situation with the Cathars. The only detailed accounts we possess come from those who hunted, tortured, and executed them. The voices of the Cathars themselves, gentle, ascetic, spiritually radical, are silent. Their scriptures and poems, their debates and metaphors, their prayers and rituals have been mostly lost to fire and fear. And this was not accidental. This was strategy. By erasing their writings, the Church reshaped the narrative. Chronicles written by Catholic clerics reframed the Albigensian Crusade as a righteous cleansing of a corrupted people. Massacres were justified, burnings were minimized or glorified. Cathar beliefs were distorted into grotesque caricatures, accusations of devil worship, sexual immorality, or unnatural practices. Anything that made them seem monstrous, alien, or irrational was amplified. If you destroy a movement's memory and replace it with manufactured stories, then even future sympathizers will never fully grasp what was lost. For centuries, this narrative dominated Europe. Schoolchildren learned of the Cathars as a strange medieval heresy, rightfully extinguished. Scholars repeated church claims uncritically. The genocide was softened into religious conflict. The Inquisition's horrors were reframed as unfortunate necessities. The Cathars themselves became shadows, footnotes, distortions, myths. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this erasure is not what was destroyed, but what was prevented. By eliminating the Cathars, the Church ensured that the Gnostic strain of early Christianity, one that emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutional authority, would not re-emerge to challenge Catholic supremacy. If Cathar ideas had survived intact, Christianity might have developed in an entirely different direction. The concept of salvation might have been centered on inner enlightenment rather than obedience to dogma. Women might have held spiritual authority. The material world might have been seen as symbolic rather than sacred. The Church's immense wealth might have been questioned at its foundation. Instead, these possibilities were buried beneath centuries of enforced silence. Even today, scholars attempting to reconstruct Cathar theology face an almost impossible task. The surviving records are filtered through inquisitors whose aim was not understanding but eradication. Every confession may contain truth, exaggeration, or invention, and often all three. Every description of Cathar ritual is framed by someone who believed the ritual itself to be a crime. Every theological explanation is colored by a worldview that saw gnosis as lethal poison. This is what successful erasure looks like. The Cathars were not just destroyed, they were made unknowable. But despite the Vatican's near-total victory, something remained. A faint echo, a whisper, a shadow beneath the official story. The tragedy of Montségur. The Inquisition's meticulous records. The rumors that Cathar parfaits carried a secret treasure, perhaps a manuscript, perhaps a mystical teaching, down the mountain before surrendering. The persistent medieval belief that Montségur had guarded a profound spiritual truth the Church could not tolerate. And it raises a question that still haunts historians and seekers today. What Gnostic wisdom was so threatening, so destabilizing, that the world's most powerful religious institution devoted a century to erasing it? The Cathars may be gone, their books may be ashes, their fortresses may be ruined, but the silence that replaced them speaks loudly, too loudly. Sometimes the absence of truth reveals more than the truth itself. The persecution of the Cathars might seem like distant medieval history, but its patterns and mechanisms remain disturbingly relevant. First, it established the template for religious genocide that would be repeated throughout European history. The Spanish Inquisition, the persecution of Protestants in Catholic regions and Catholics in Protestant regions during the Reformation, the hunting of witches, all followed procedures and justifications pioneered during the anti-Cathar campaigns. Second, it demonstrated how institutions use orthodoxy as a tool of control. When an organization defines a single correct interpretation of truth and treats alternatives as existential threats, violence becomes almost inevitable. This pattern appears not just in religious contexts, but in political ideologies, scientific paradigms, and cultural movements. Third, the Albigensian Crusade shows how quickly defensive violence can escalate into genocide when a powerful institution feels threatened. The Church initially sought to debate and persuade the Cathars. When that failed, it moved to coercion, then to military force, then to systematic elimination, and finally to the erasure of memory. Each step was justified as necessary to preserve unity and truth. Fourth, The Cathar genocide reveals the politics of religious tolerance. The Languedoc region had initially been relatively tolerant, with Catholics, Cathars, and Jews living in proximity. The Crusade and Inquisition destroyed this pluralistic society, replacing it with enforced religious uniformity backed by state violence. The message was clear. Tolerance of alternative beliefs threatens institutional power. Today, we see similar dynamics in how orthodoxies, whether religious, political, or ideological, treat dissent. When institutions claim monopolies on truth, when they conflate disagreement with danger, when they use power to suppress rather than persuade, they follow patterns established centuries ago in the mountains of southern France. The Cathars also pose uncomfortable questions about historical progress. We often assume human civilization moves inevitably toward greater tolerance and freedom of conscience. But the Cathars show us that tolerant, sophisticated societies can be violently replaced by intolerant ones. The cosmopolitan culture of 12th century Languedoc, with its troubadours, its religious diversity, its relative gender equality among Cathars, was crushed and replaced by rigid orthodoxy and royal absolutism. Progress is never guaranteed. To understand the full weight of what was lost, we must return to the heart of Cathar theology, their vision of salvation. For the Church, salvation flowed downward through hierarchy, God to Pope, Pope to bishops, bishops to priests, priests to people. It was a system that required obedience, ritual, and institutional mediation. But for the Cathars, salvation flowed upward, from the imprisoned soul back to the divine realm of pure spirit. It required no church, no sacraments, no hierarchy, and certainly no material intermediaries. It required only gnosis, inner knowing. The Cathars believed that every human soul was a fragment of the divine, trapped in a false world created by the demiurge, a cunning architect who shaped matter as a cage. Life, with all its suffering, violence, and corruption, was not punishment. It was imprisonment. The goal was not to be forgiven for sins, but to escape the illusion of the material realm altogether. This understanding did not make Cathars pessimistic. It made them transcendent. To them, death was not something to fear. It was a doorway, a return, a homecoming. The Catholic Church taught that salvation required participation in rituals, baptism, confession, mass, penance. The Cathars believed these rituals were meaningless because they took place in a world that was itself a deception. Bread and wine could not become Christ's body and blood because Christ never took on flesh. Churches could not be sacred because they were built of matter, the demiurge's domain. Even the crucifixion was symbolic, a divine message rather than a physical event. Their only true sacrament was the consolamentum, a spiritual baptism performed through the laying on of hands. It symbolized the awakening of the soul, the moment it recognized the prison it lived in and reconnected with the divine source. Receiving the consolamentum meant one was ready to begin shedding the illusions of matter, to live in radical purity, no meat, no violence, no lies, no sexuality, no ownership. These were not rules meant to torture the body. They were practices meant to free the soul from the demands of flesh, from the traps of the demiurge. Many believers waited until they were near death to receive the consolamentum, not out of fear, but out of reverence. To live afterward as a parfait required immense discipline, and if one sinned after receiving it, the ritual might be voided. For some, especially the severely ill, the consolamentum led to the endura, a voluntary fasting unto death. Catholic chroniclers portrayed this as suicide, but to the Cathars it was the final act of liberation, the soul refusing to reattach itself to the illusions of the material world. This was the Gnostic truth the Vatican feared most, the idea that God was accessible without the Church. If salvation was an inward awakening rather than an institutional transaction, the Church's spiritual monopoly dissolved. If Christ was a spiritual messenger rather than a physical deity, the Church's sacraments lost meaning. If the material world was a deception, the Church's wealth and power became evidence of its entanglement with the demiurge. And if women could be parfaits, equal in authority, purity, and spiritual insight, the Church's patriarchal hierarchy collapsed. The Cathars did not simply challenge Catholic doctrine, they inverted it. They proposed that the world's suffering was not humanity's fault, but evidence of a flawed creation. They suggested that God did not demand obedience, ritual, or loyalty, only awakening. They taught that institutions could not save the soul, because institutions belonged to the very world the soul sought to escape. It was a theology that dignified the individual, stripped power from hierarchy, and reframed salvation as a personal journey rather than a communal obligation. It was, in many ways, the most dangerous idea the medieval church had ever encountered. For if a peasant in Languedoc could find God without a priest, if a dying woman could receive the consolamentum and leap past the chains of matter, if a starving parfait could face death with serenity because he believed the flames were not punishment, but transcendence, then what was the purpose of Rome? What remained of its authority? What justified its wealth, its lands, its rituals, its supremacy? In this light, the genocide becomes brutally comprehensible. The Cathars were not killed for being wrong, they were killed because they might have been right. The Vatican did not fear dualism, it feared liberation. It feared a Christianity that needed no church. It feared a truth that placed divine power inside every human soul, beyond the reach of Rome's control. And so, the Cathars' salvation doctrine, gentle, ascetic, radiant with Gnostic mysticism, had to be buried, burned, distorted, and erased. What survived is only a ghost of what once was. But even that ghost is enough to terrify anyone who understands what it implies. Human beings may never have needed a gatekeeper to reach God. So what can we conclude about the Cathars, their persecution, and the truths the Vatican tried to suppress? First, the historical facts are clear. What happened to the Cathars constitutes genocide by any reasonable definition. A religious and ethnic group was targeted for systematic destruction. Military force, legal persecution, and cultural erasure were employed to eliminate them. The campaign was organized, sustained over decades, and ultimately successful in destroying the Cathar community. Second, this genocide was driven primarily by institutional self-preservation rather than theological conviction. The Catholic Church faced an alternative Christian tradition that questioned its authority, wealth, and necessity. Rather than compete through persuasion, the Church used its political power to physically eliminate the competition. Third, the Gnostic truth. The Cathars preserved wasn't so much a specific doctrine as a broader principle that individuals can access divine truth directly without institutional mediation. This principle threatened, and still threatens, any organization claiming monopoly on spiritual authority. Fourth, the persecution of the Cathars established methods and justifications for religious violence that shaped European history for centuries. The Inquisition, the concept of holy war against Christians, the conflation of heresy with treason, all became normalized through the anti-Cathar campaigns. Fifth, the successful historical erasure of the Cathars demonstrates how power shapes memory. For centuries, the Catholic Church's version of events dominated. Only with modern critical scholarship have we begun to recover something closer to the truth. This reminds us to question official narratives and seek suppressed voices, but perhaps most importantly, the Cathars remind us of the human capacity for conviction and courage. Those 225 people who walked into the flames at Montségur weren't weak or deluded. They were individuals who had found meaning in their beliefs and refused to betray them even facing certain death. We may not share their theological views, but we can recognize their dignity and strength. The Vatican hoped to erase the Cathars completely, their people, their ideas, their memory. They very nearly succeeded, but the outline remains, like a shadow burned into stone. And in that shadow, we can read lessons about power, belief, violence, and the human spirit that remain relevant today. The Cathars are gone. Their books are burned. Their fortresses are ruins. But the questions they raised about authority, spiritual autonomy, and institutional power, those questions remain unanswered. And perhaps that's the truth the Vatican feared most. Not the specific theological claims of the Cathars, but the deeper question underneath. Who decides what truth is? Who has authority over the human soul? Is institutional mediation necessary for spiritual knowledge, or can individuals access the divine directly? These questions didn't die on the pyre at Montségur. They echo through history, challenging every institution that claims monopoly on truth. And they remain as relevant now as they were in the mountains of medieval France, when people chose flames over submission. The Cathars' genocide was meant to be the end of their story. Instead, it became a question that history continues to ask. If this hidden history revealed something you didn't know, if it made you question what else might have been erased from our collective memory, then share this video. The best response to historical erasure is making sure these stories get told. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Do you think the Cathars' ideas were genuinely dangerous, or was this simply institutional power protecting itself? And hit subscribe, because there are more suppressed histories waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, history is written by the victors, but it doesn't have to stay that way.